3 years after betrayal, the millionaire sees his ex-fiancée at a gala and learns the truth he never expected. Welcome to Mr. Carter's Stories. Get ready for heart-pounding romance, jaw-dropping betrayals, and twists that will leave you breathless. From passionate billionaire romances to emotional second-chance love stories, every tale is packed with intensity, drama, and unforgettable moments. Don't just read, feel every emotion. Subscribe, follow, and dive into a world where love is never simple, but always worth it. New stories coming soon. Stay tuned. The grand ballroom of the Blackwood Hotel was a vision of opulence. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the high ceilings, casting golden light over the elegantly dressed guests who floated across the marble floor, exchanging pleasantries with the practiced ease of the elite. Laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses wove together in a melody of wealth and privilege. Alexander Grayson stood in the center of it all, a king among men, a force of power wrapped in a tailored black tuxedo. He exuded dominance, his sharp gray eyes scanning the room with detached indifference. These events bored him. The same faces, the same false smiles, the same empty conversations about stock markets and luxury vacations. He lifted a glass of scotch to his lips, already thinking about an excuse to leave. But then, his world stopped. It started as a whisper in the back of his mind, a ripple of something unexplainable, a presence, a shadow from the past. Then he saw her, and the breath was knocked from his lungs. Across the room, just beyond the grand staircase, stood the one woman he never thought he'd see again, Isabella Carter. His fingers clenched around the delicate crystal glass, his entire body stiffening as a flood of emotions crashed into him all at once. Disbelief, shock, guilt, and something far more dangerous, something that made his chest ache. She was here, the woman he had once vowed to spend his life with, the woman he had once held in his arms, whispering promises of forever, the woman he had abandoned without looking back. 3 years. 3 years of searching for answers, of questioning his own decisions, of drowning in regret he never dared to name. And now here she was. She hadn't seen him yet. She stood poised and graceful, oblivious to the chaos unraveling inside him. She was more breathtaking than he remembered, if that was even possible. Her deep emerald gown clung to her curves, her dark hair cascading in loose waves over her bare shoulders. She looked stronger, more confident, more untouchable. His chest tightened painfully. And then, just when he thought the moment couldn't shatter him further, his gaze dropped to the child standing beside her. A boy, small, fragile, no older than 3. His heart pounded violently against his ribs as his eyes locked onto the child's face. Stormy gray irises stared back at him. His color, his features, his blood. Alexander inhaled sharply. The glass in his hand slipped from his fingers and crashed onto the marble floor, shattering into 1,000 pieces. The noise made heads turn. Conversations paused, but Alexander didn't care. He couldn't breathe. His gaze flickered back to Isabella. As if sensing his presence, she slowly turned. Their eyes met, and the world tilted. Her expression didn't change, not even a flicker of emotion. No shock, no anger, no pain, nothing. She looked right at him as if he were a stranger, as if he had never meant anything to her, as if she had buried him in the past. But Alexander, he felt as if he had just seen a ghost. For the first time in his life, Alexander Grayson was unsteady. The moment their eyes met, 1,000 unspoken words raged between them. But Isabella stood still, her face unreadable. She wasn't trembling, wasn't flustered. She was calm, detached, like she hadn't just shattered his entire world. His breath was ragged as he stormed forward, weaving through the crowd, his pulse hammering in his ears, his fingers curled into fists, his mind drowning in questions. Why was she here? Why hadn't she reached out? And the most gut-wrenching question of all, why didn't she look surprised to see him? As he approached, Isabella turned slightly, as if sensing him before he even spoke. Isabella. His voice was raw, rough, a name he had whispered in the dead of night, a name he had dreamed of calling again. But her expression didn't change. She looked at him with cool detachment, her emerald green eyes void of the warmth they once held for him. No anger, no relief. Just nothing. Mr. Grayson, she said smoothly. Alexander's entire body stiffened. Mr. Grayson? His teeth clenched. That was not how this was supposed to go. That's all you have to say? His voice was low, edged with something dangerously close to desperation. After 3 years, she tilted her head, studying him with mild curiosity. What more is there to say? The indifference in her tone burned more than if she had slapped him. His jaw locked. He had imagined this moment 1,000 different ways. Her crying, her screaming at him, demanding answers. Something. But this cold, distant version of Isabella? He didn't know how to fight her when she acted like he didn't exist. His gaze flickered downward, toward the small child still clutching her hand, the little boy with his eyes. Something sharp twisted inside him, and his voice was barely a whisper when he asked, "Is he mine?" Isabella's lips parted. For a second, just a fraction of a second, something flickered in her eyes. Panic? Pain? Then just as quickly it was gone. She opened her mouth, but before she could answer, another voice cut through the tension. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" Alexander's blood turned to ice. A man approached from behind, sliding a hand around Isabella's waist with casual familiarity. Possessiveness. Alexander's spine went rigid, his hands clenching at his sides. "Sweetheart." The word echoed in his head, sharp and cruel. A word he had once whispered against her lips in the dark. Isabella glanced at the man, and for the first time since Alexander had laid eyes on her tonight, something changed in her expression. She softened. Not for him, for someone else. The realization hit Alexander like a wrecking ball to the chest. Isabella had moved on. His heart pounded, something dark and unfamiliar rising in his throat. He had searched for her for years, and here she was, living a life he hadn't been a part of. Married, engaged, with his son. His world tilted, and for the first time, Alexander Grayson knew what it felt like to be truly powerless. Alexander had never been a man who accepted defeat, and he wasn't about to start now. His heart was still pounding, his mind racing as Isabella turned away, slipping further into the gala with the man at her side. The stranger who had touched her so familiarly, called her sweetheart. Rage burned in his chest, but beneath it was something worse. Something he refused to name. His jaw tightened. Number, she wasn't getting away. Not this time. Ignoring the murmurs and stolen glances from curious onlookers, Alexander stalked after her, his long strides cutting through the crowd with ruthless determination. Isabella Carter thought she could act like he was nothing, like the past meant nothing. She was about to learn that he didn't let go. Not of her, not of their son, and not of the she felt him before she saw him. The heat of his presence, the force of his stare boring into her back as she stepped onto the balcony, desperate for air, desperate to escape him. She should have known better. "You don't get to walk away from me, Isabella." The deep, commanding voice sent a shiver down her spine, but she forced herself to remain still, her hands curling around the cold iron railing. Slowly she turned. Alexander stood there, his broad frame tense, his stormy gray eyes burning with questions, with demands. She lifted her chin. "I just did." His jaw flexed. "You think you can ignore me? Pretend like the past never happened?" "The past?" Isabella let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Oh, Alexander, you killed the past." His entire body went rigid. Her words were a dagger to the gut, and she knew it. For a moment, something flashed in his expression. Pain, regret. Then it was gone, replaced by raw, unrelenting determination. "I need answers, Isabella," he said, his voice thick with something dangerously close to desperation. "I need to know if he's mine." She stared at him, at the man who had once been her whole world, the man who had abandoned her without a second glance, and now he wanted answers. Anger burned through her, sharp and consuming. "You don't deserve to know," she whispered. Alexander inhaled sharply, as if she had physically struck him. "Isabella, you left me." Her voice was ice, her green eyes filled with fire. "You abandoned me, Alexander. You cast me aside like I was nothing. And now you want answers?" She stepped forward, close enough to see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers curled into fists. You lost that right the night you walked away? His breathing was uneven. I thought you thought wrong. Silence hung heavy between them, thick with words unsaid, wounds still bleeding. Then finally Isabella delivered the final blow. You want the truth, Alexander? She leaned in, her voice a whisper of pure devastation. You were never supposed to see us again. His heart stopped. Isabella pulled back, her eyes flickering with something he couldn't place. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Grayson felt fear. Because there was more to this story, and he wasn't sure he was ready to hear it. Alexander had always believed in control, in power, in shaping his own fate. But now for the first time, he realized his past had been rewritten by someone else's hands, and he was about to burn the world down to find out who. The moment Isabella disappeared into the crowd, Alexander stormed out of the gala, his mind a whirlwind of fury and unanswered questions. You were never supposed to see us again. Her words echoed in his head, each syllable cutting deeper than the last. Something was wrong, very, very wrong. This wasn't just a lover's betrayal. This wasn't just heartbreak. Someone had interfered. Someone had ripped them apart, and he had been blind to it. He pulled out his phone as he slid into the back seat of his car, his voice sharp as he barked into the receiver. Find out everything you can about Isabella Carter's life these past 3 years. Every place she's lived, every person she's spoken to. I want names, records, everything. A pause, then a hesitant voice on the other end. Sir, are you sure? After what happened? Alexander's grip on the phone tightened. I don't pay you to ask questions. I pay you to get answers. A beat of silence, then, yes, sir. I'll start immediately. Alexander ended the call, his jaw clenched. Someone had taken 3 years of his life, 3 years with his son, and whoever they were about to regret it. It didn't take long. Money was power. Power was access. And Alexander Grayson had both in abundance. Within 24 hours, the truth began to unravel. Files landed on his desk. Bank statements, medical records, old lease agreements, pieces of a puzzle that had been hidden from him for far too long. And at the center of it all, a name he never expected. The blood in his veins turned to ice as he read the report in front of him. His stomach twisted, his vision blurred with rage. No, he whispered, his voice low and deadly. Betrayal burned through him like acid. Because the person who had orchestrated Isabella's downfall, the person who had lied to him, manipulated him, stolen years from him, was someone he had trusted, someone close, someone who had wanted her gone, someone who had wanted them apart. And they had succeeded. For 3 goddamn years they had won. Until now. Until tonight. Alexander's hands curled into fists, his body vibrating with barely restrained fury. Because now he knew the truth, and he was about to destroy them all. Isabella had always known pain. She had felt it in the cold silence of an empty apartment, in the long, sleepless nights with a crying newborn in her arms, in the suffocating fear that haunted her every time she looked over her shoulder. But nothing compared to the pain of standing in front of him again. Alexander Grayson, the father of her child, the man who had shattered her world. And now he stood before her, demanding answers, demanding the truth she had spent 3 years hiding. She wanted to hate him. She should hate him. But as she stared into those stormy gray eyes, her son's eyes, her walls trembled. Tell me everything. Alexander's voice was low, rough, a demand, a plea. They were alone now, standing in the dimly lit garden behind the gala. The sounds of laughter and music were distant, swallowed by the tension between them. Isabella clenched her fists, willing herself to stay strong, to remember the years of loneliness, the nights she had cried herself to sleep. You want the truth? Her voice wavered, but she lifted her chin. Fine, here it is. Her fingers curled around the railing behind her as she took a slow breath, and then she let it all out. I was 20 weeks pregnant when I realized you weren't coming back. Her words were sharp, cutting through the night like a blade. I waited for you, Alexander. I waited and waited until I couldn't anymore. His jaw clenched, his hands trembling at his sides. I didn't know. She let out a bitter laugh. Number you didn't. And do you know why? Her green eyes burned as they met his. Because someone made sure you never did. His breath caught. He already knew that now, but hearing it from her, hearing the raw betrayal in her voice, was like a knife to his gut. They made me disappear. Isabella's voice cracked, but she forced herself to continue. They took my job, my apartment, my life. I lost everything overnight. Alexander's entire body stiffened. Who? His voice was deadly. She shook her head. I don't know. I only knew that I had to run, to protect our son. His breath came fast, uneven. You should have come to me. Her laughter was hollow. You left me, Alexander. He flinched. No. She cut him off, her eyes flashing. You don't get to rewrite history. You don't get to act like you were the victim. Her voice softened then, breaking like a wave against the shore. You weren't the one who had to give birth alone in a hospital with no one to hold your hand. Alexander staggered back, as if the words had physically struck him. You weren't the one who spent nights crying because your baby had a fever and you didn't have enough money for medicine. His hands shook. You weren't the one who had to choose between feeding yourself or feeding your child. Her voice cracked, but she refused to stop. He needed to hear this. I was alone, Alexander. Alone. His breathing was ragged, his chest heaving. She could see it in his eyes, the storm of emotions crashing inside him. Guilt, rage, despair. And then, something else. Something dangerous. A vow. Isabella turned away, her shoulders trembling. She had spent 3 years hating him. But now as she stood there, staring at the man who had unknowingly abandoned her, the father of her child, she didn't know what she felt anymore. Could she ever trust him again? Did she even want to? And God help her. What if her heart had already made the decision for her? The storm raged outside, the wind howling through the trees like a beast prowling in the darkness. Rain slammed against the windows, drowning out the quiet crackle of the fireplace inside the remote cabin. The power had gone out an hour ago, leaving nothing but the flickering glow of flames to illuminate the tension-filled space. Tension that crackled hotter than the fire itself. Isabella sat on the worn leather couch, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, trying to ignore the presence of the man standing just a few feet away. Alexander, the man who had abandoned her, the man who had just learned the real cost of his betrayal, the man who now stood with his back to her, shoulders tense, dangerously quiet. She didn't know how they had ended up here together. 1 minute she had been leaving the gala in a desperate attempt to escape him. The next, the storm had turned deadly, roads flooding, visibility dropping to zero, and Alexander had refused to let her go alone. Now they were stranded, just the two of them, and the past they had tried so hard to bury. Do you regret it? His voice was low, strained, the first words he had spoken in over an hour. Isabella's fingers tightened around the blanket draped over her lap. She didn't turn around. Regret what? Us. The word hung between them, heavy and dangerous. Her breath caught, her throat tightening. Did she? Did she regret loving him? Regret the nights they had spent tangled together, whispering dreams into each other's skin? Regret the way his touch had once made her feel alive? She squeezed her eyes shut. It doesn't matter anymore. It does to me. She let out a bitter laugh. Now? Now it matters to you? He turned then, his gray eyes dark with frustration. Damn it, Isabella. His voice was rough, raw, desperate. For the first time she saw it, the guilt carved into his features, the pain, the regret. It twisted something inside her, something she wasn't ready to name. She shot up from the couch, the air between them electric. You don't get to do this, Alexander. You don't get to act like you're the victim here. His hands clenched at his sides. I never said I was. Then why are we even talking about this? She snapped, her pulse hammering. It's over. It's been over for 3 years. Silence, thick, suffocating. And then why are you shaking? Her breath hitched. He took a step closer, then another. Dangerously close now. His scent, expensive cologne, cedarwood, and something unmistakably him, wrapped around her, pulling her back into a past she had no business reliving. But she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, because he was right. Her hands trembled at her sides, her body betraying her. Alexander lifted a hand, hesitated, and then his fingers brushed against her cheek. A whisper of a touch, a ghost of a memory. Her body shuddered. "Tell me to stop," he murmured. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Tell him to stop. Push him away. Remind him of every tear, every sleepless night, every moment of agony he had caused her. But then, he leaned in, and her world collapsed. The moment their lips met, it was like striking a match in a room filled with gasoline. Explosive, blinding, consuming. He kissed her like a starving man, like she was the only thing keeping him alive. And God help her. She kissed him back. Her fingers curled into his shirt, desperate, needy, craving the heat she had denied herself for so long. It wasn't soft. It wasn't careful. It was 3 years of longing, 3 years of anger, 3 years of love and hate colliding all at once. His hands gripped her waist, pulling her flush against him, his mouth devouring her, his breath ragged. "I never stopped," he whispered against her lips. She trembled. "Stopped what?" "Loving you." Her heart shattered, because for the first time, she realized maybe she had never stopped either. The past had been a lie, a carefully orchestrated deception, a web of manipulation designed to tear them apart. And Alexander had fallen for it. God help him. He had believed it. The fire had long since died in the fireplace, but the storm still raged outside. Inside, Alexander stood frozen, staring at the documents spread across the wooden table. The evidence was all there. The betrayal, the deception, the reason he had left Isabella behind. Emails, fabricated bank transactions. Lies whispered in his ear by someone he had trusted. Someone who had made sure he walked away from the woman he loved. His stomach twisted violently. His hands clenched into fists. He had been a fool, a blind, gullible fool. Behind him, Isabella watched in silence, her arms wrapped around herself, her expression unreadable. "You really believed I cheated on you?" Her voice was quiet, hollow. Alexander closed his eyes, the weight of his mistake suffocating. "They showed me proof." His voice was raw, edged with pain. "Bank records, photos, emails from your account." Her bitter laugh cut through him like a blade. "And you never once thought to ask me?" His chest ached. "I was angry. I was hurt. And when they told me you—" He swallowed, his voice breaking. "I was stupid, Isabella, and I will never forgive myself for it." Silence stretched between them, thick with years of unspoken pain. He turned to face her then, his heart hammering. "I need you to know, I would have never left you if I had known the truth." His voice was desperate now, urgent. "I would have never—" "But you did." Her voice wavered, and that's when he saw it, the sheen of unshed tears in her eyes, the pain she had carried alone for 3 long years. He took a step toward her, then another. "I know I don't deserve another chance," he murmured. "I don't even deserve your forgiveness. But I swear to you, Isabella, I will spend the rest of my life making this right." She inhaled sharply, like his words physically struck her. He reached out, gently cradling her face between his hands. "I love you," he whispered. "I never stopped." She trembled beneath his touch. Her walls were breaking. And then, a sound shattered the moment. Glass, breaking. Both of them spun toward the window just as the wind howled violently through the trees outside. Alexander's body went rigid. Something felt wrong. He moved fast, reaching for his phone, his instincts screaming at him. Then, a text flashed across his screen. Unknown number. "You should have stayed away." His blood ran cold. And before he could react, a crash, a gunshot, and Isabella's scream ripping through the night. The world blurred into chaos. The moment the gunshot rang out, Alexander moved, fast. He grabbed Isabella, shielding her with his body, scanning the darkness for the threat. But he was too late. A second later, the lights cut out. A sharp, high-pitched scream split the night. Not Isabella's, their son. Number Alexander spun just in time to see masked men shoving Isabella and their child into a black SUV. Rage ignited inside him, primal, all-consuming. Isabella! He ran like a man possessed. The car screeched away, tires skidding over wet pavement. Alexander lunged, his fingers just barely grazing the handle. But it was gone, vanished into the storm, and with it, his family. Hours later, the ransom message came through at dawn. It wasn't money they wanted. It wasn't power. It was revenge. A voice recording, distorted, cold. Walk away from Alexander Grayson, Isabella. Disappear. For good. Or he loses everything. The breath hitched in her throat. She sat in a dark, damp warehouse, bound to a chair, her son sleeping fitfully in her lap, his small face buried against her chest. She had spent 3 years running, 3 years hiding, and now it all came down to a single choice. If she stayed, Alexander would suffer. He would lose his empire, his reputation, everything he had built. But if she walked away, she would never see him again, never feel his touch, never let him hold their son. Tears burned her eyes. The choice was impossible, a cruel, merciless trap. And just as the door creaked open, revealing the shadow of her captor, a gunshot rang out, and hell came crashing down. Time had run out. Alexander didn't wait for backup, didn't hesitate. The moment he traced the call, he moved. Gun in hand, heart pounding, he stormed through the abandoned warehouse, ready to burn the world down to get Isabella and their son back. His vision blurred with rage, with fear, and then a scream. Isabella. It was coming from behind a steel door at the far end of the hall. His chest tightened. Hold on, sweetheart. I'm coming. But just as he stepped forward, click, a gun cocked behind his head. Drop it. The voice was cold, familiar. Alexander's fingers tensed around the trigger, his mind racing. And then slowly, he turned. His stomach dropped. Because standing there, gun aimed at his heart, was the last person he ever expected. His own brother. Ethan? Betrayal crashed through Alexander like a wrecking ball. Ethan's lips curled into a smirk. Cruel. Calculated. You just couldn't leave it alone, could you? His voice was laced with venom. Alexander's grip on his gun tightened. You did this. Ethan sighed, shaking his head. I tried to save you, Alex. I tried to get rid of her before she ruined you. His blood ran cold. You're the one who set me up. Ethan's smirk didn't waver. You were supposed to move on. Forget her. His expression darkened. But you had to go looking for the truth. Alexander's pulse thundered. His own brother. The person he had trusted most. And he had orchestrated everything. You stole 3 years from me. Alexander's voice was low. Dangerous. You took my son from me. Ethan didn't even flinch. And I'd do it again. Alexander saw red, but before he could move, a gunshot. Pain exploded in his side. He staggered, gritting his teeth as fire tore through his ribs. But he didn't fall, didn't stop, because from inside the room, Isabella screamed. Adrenaline kicked in. Alexander lunged. One shot, one perfect shot. Ethan's smirk vanished in an instant. His body went rigid, then collapsed to the floor. Dead. But Alexander didn't stop to watch. Didn't care about the pain burning through his body, because he had one mission left. Get to Isabella. And as he kicked the door open, she was there, tears streaming down her face, their son clutched to her chest. Safe. Alive. And the moment their eyes met, everything else faded. The past was over. The monster who had torn them apart was gone. But as Alexander lay in a hospital bed, stitches lining his side, he knew this battle wasn't over, because Isabella still hadn't given him an answer. Would she stay, or would she walk away, forever? 2 days later, she found him on the balcony of the penthouse, staring out over the city. A light breeze ruffled his dark hair, but he didn't turn, didn't speak, and neither did she. For a long moment, they just stood there, the past stretching between them like an unbridgeable canyon. Finally, Alexander exhaled. I understand if you can't forgive me. His voice was low, rough. If you walk away, I won't stop you. She flinched, because she had imagined this moment for years. Imagined telling him he didn't deserve her, that she had survived without him and didn't need him now. But standing here, seeing the pain in his eyes, she realized the truth. She had never stopped loving him, even when she hated him, even when she swore she would never let him back in. Her heart had always been his. Tears burned her eyes. You hurt me, Alexander. His jaw tightened. I know. I was alone, she whispered, raising our son, running from enemies I didn't understand. And you weren't there. His eyes darkened with agony. I should have been, he admitted. I should have fought for you. I should have trusted you. But I failed you, Isabella. Her breath hitched. And then he did something she never expected. He dropped to one knee, not in a grand romantic gesture, not with a ring or a speech, but with raw, unshakable devotion. I can't change the past, he murmured, but if you let me, I'll spend the rest of my life making up for it. Her vision blurred. God, she wanted to believe him, to believe that love could triumph over pain, that they could heal. She took a step forward, then another, until she was right there, standing before him. I don't need grand promises, she whispered. I just need you to stay. His fingers trembled as he reached for her hand. I'm not going anywhere. A sob caught in her throat, and as she fell into his arms, as his lips crashed against hers in a desperate, soul-deep kiss, she knew. It was never farewell. It had only ever been forever.